He came in the room,
You'd speak up, please, ma'am.
he came in the room and spoke like he always do.
And what did he tell you?
That he was sitting at the house. He was at the house.
Say it again.
He was at the house.
And I'm not 100% following you. He was telling you or saying to you that he was at the house?
Mm-hmm.
When?
The night of the murders.
The night of the murders?
Yes.
What was he telling you about that he was at the house the night of the murders?
That he'd been there 30 to 40 minutes.
Was he telling you that? Did he ask you anything about that when he was talking to you?
Yes. Yes.
Did he indicate to you what he wanted you to do with that information?
No. No.
What did he say?
He just said that he was at the house for 30 to 40 minutes. I said.
You said what? Was he there 30 or 40 minutes that night?
Not to my recall.
Why are you crying, Ms. Smith?
Good morning, Robin. On the day of those murders, Alec Murdaugh had just taken his dying father back to the hospital, and he went to check on his mother. His family tells us when he returned to his home, he made that gruesome discovery.
I was at the house. I left the house and went to my mom's for just a little while. Tried to call her when I left. Texted her, no response. When I got back to the house was obviously nobody was in there, so I figured they're still up here fooling around.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Did you know when it comes to Alex Murdaugh's alibi, there have been at least 3 versions? So the question arises, did the idea that Murdaugh had an ironclad alibi, that was how it was reported in the beginning, did that arise in a kind of the same way that he negotiated settlements and whatnot with his clients? You know what? I've got I'm giving you an ironclad. If you come to me, the fact that you're going to get money out of this, it's ironclad. Believe me when I tell you that. In other words, as the CFO at Parker Law Group said during today's testimony,
manipulate people into settlements and clients into liking him. So he did it through the art of bullshit, basically.
Hold on, let's get that again. How did he get that ironclad alibi?
So he did it through the art of bullshit, basically.
He did it through the art of bullshit, basically. So could he have gotten an alibi through the art of bullshit? What do you think? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind, I'll be doing a long overdue live stream dealing with the Alec Baldwin case, and what I've tried to do is boil down all of the information to one simple reason why the incident happened. And it's actually a lot simpler than people think, and it's a lot more shocking, I think, than people think. And recently a 60 Minutes documentary on the Rust incident has come out that has further reinforced this notion. So look out for that. That'll be 9 p.m. Pacific time or midnight Eastern. So look out for that. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So how many versions of Murdaugh's alibi are we talking about here? Well, at least 3. Version 1, the original version, You heard what he said at the scene to law enforcement inside the vehicle. It's the idea that he left the house without confirming where anyone was and before getting any answer, and then he went to his mother's home, got his alibi, and came back.
What made you come out here at night?
I went to, my mom's a late stage Alzheimer's patient. My dad's in the hospital. My mom gets anxious when she does. I went to check on them and Maggie. Maggie's a dog lover, and she fools with the dogs. And I knew she'd gone to the kennel. I was at the house. I left the house and went to my mom's for just a little while. Tried to call her when I left. Texted her, no response. When I got back to the house was obviously nobody was in there.
Now, I find it quite interesting that he says, when I texted her, no response. It's the same kind of thing you say in a medical situation. I checked for a sign of life, but there was no response, right? Wouldn't you normally say that I got no answer, right? Anyway, in that version, he pertinently tells law enforcement that he was at his mother's home for a little while. How long is a little while? The law enforcement officer should have asked, but he didn't. Well, now the housekeeper, the caretaker, the caregiver, she was able to nail that time down to just 15 to 20 minutes, which is extraordinary.
How long did he stay there?
Just last minute.
I forgot.
20 minutes. 20 minutes.
What was he telling you about that he was at the house the night of the murder?
That he'd been there 30 to 40 minutes.
The question no one seems to be asking is, how can she be so absolutely sure that he wasn't there for 30 to 40 minutes, but rather 15 to 20? What's 5 or 10 minutes? How can she be so sure? She's testifying almost 18 months later. How can she be so sure of the time? Unfortunately, the prosecuting attorney didn't ask her directly which show she was watching, right, on television, but she did refer to a show on the game show channel, and when she does say that, it's sort of a little bit muffled. But game shows in America are typically 30 minutes. If Murdaugh arrived after a game show started and left before it ended, then his visit would certainly be less than 30 minutes. Does that make sense? So that brings us to version 2. The second version, and by that I mean the version that followed what he told law enforcement on June 8th, was that he went to Savannah. And I think the idea there is that he put his father into hospital. When I heard that version, I looked up Savannah on the map, and it's over an hour's drive there. It's about an hour and 15, which means he would likely have been away from home for around 3 hours. If you add 2 hours 30 plus around about 30 minutes at his mother, that's more than 3 hours, right? That's if he dropped in to see his mother on the way back. And that's part of his version. It does make one think about premeditation. If you think about if Murdaugh did take his father to hospital several hours earlier, and we know that his father did go to hospital that day, but if he did take his father to hospital, let's say that morning, without apparently his brother's consent, maybe his brothers did consent to that, but I don't really get that idea. But perhaps he took his father, even without his father's consent, to the hospital. Now, on the other hand, perhaps if his father did have a sudden turn for the worse, how did that come about? And then, if that did come about naturally, the idea of an inheritance may have occurred to Alex, and perhaps the plan to commit a crime at the same time, with his father as a witness out of the picture, that's how it may have manifested, right? Again, I find it very odd that his father was taken to hospital on the 7th, the day of the murders, and then brought home after that, and then he died on the 10th at the home in Almeida. Presumably his father returned home because he didn't want to be in the hospital, and perhaps Libby didn't want him in the hospital either, his mother. That brings us to version 3. In version 3, and this version seems to acknowledge his own voice on Paul's dog video, he places himself at the scene, right? In other words, he says, I was in Moselle, I was in the lounge, having fallen asleep at the house, in front of the television. Now, it would be good if he could say what he was watching, specifically when that happened. What were you watching when you fell asleep? Then he goes to his mother, even though his father is in far worse shape. I mean, his father's about to die. And he goes to his mother instead at a time that he never usually visits his mother, after 9 p.m. And he goes to his mother again a few days later, very early, at a time that's also unusual. But anyway, when he visits her on the night of the murders, he goes there at about 9 p.m. and then he returns home at about 10 p.m., just prior to the 911 call, which happens at 10:07. The problem in this version is if he goes to his mother at 9 p.m., firstly, it's just after the murders. And secondly, if he arrives back at 10 p.m., it means he drove about 19 minutes each way, right? So that's about 20 minutes one way, 20 minutes back, that's 40 minutes. You spend 20 minutes in Almeida, that brings you to an hour. And then the 911 call was made at 10:07. In other words, did he take 7 minutes to do all of this, right? Think about it. He arrives back at about 10 p.m. And then between arriving back at 10 and the 911 call at 7 minutes past 10, he must do quite a lot. It means he arrives back at the ranch. He finds no one there. All the time the clock is ticking. Then he drives down to the dog kennels. How long does that take? Then he figures out what was going on there. How long does that take? Then he checks for signs of life. Then he calls 911, and the 911 call must also take a certain length of time, right? And then when the law enforcement arrive, he's got a shotgun in his hands when the cops arrive. And that suggests that he would have to go back to the house a second time to arm himself, having realized a crime was committed. Anyway, one more thing. In yesterday's live, I suggested that legal maneuvers following the boat incident were afoot long before the lawsuit was actually filed in January 2022. Now we've got confirmation that things were taking place as early as October 2020. In other words, around about 9 months before the murders, there was this situation where Tinsey wanted to him to show his books, right? That's according to Mark Tinsey, the attorney dealing with the Mallory Beach incident. By the way, I've just had confirmation coming through on Twitter that the show that the caregiver was watching is called America Says. It's 20 to 22 minutes long. There you have it. So I wouldn't be surprised if Murdaugh arrived at very close to 9 o'clock when the show started and then left by the time the show ended and kind of prevented the caregiver from actually watching the show. That he actually arrived and left at the time that the show was supposed to be showing. And that makes it 20 minutes. Does that make sense? So in conclusion, if Paul's dog video, the audio from that, if that led to any doubt about Murdaugh's ironclad alibi, well, Shelley Smith has added substantially to that doubt. Can you see how they kind of go hand in hand? The dog video makes you think, maybe his alibi is not quite accurate. But then the caregiver's story also shows that there's reason to not want to take his alibi at face value. Personally, I find the numerous alibi scenarios here match this idea that the CFO has portrayed of Murdaugh as a bullshitter.
So he did it through the art of bullshit, basically.
I'll put a link in the description to his brothers sort of sniveling, literally with tissues, wiping their noses and tears in their eyes. Also very emotional, very dramatic. The question is it also quite manipulative? This whole idea that barely a week after the murders, they go on Good Morning America and try to convince viewers of their brother's innocence. Now, I'll leave it to you to decide if being a good lawyer can be interpreted as being a good bullshitter. I can think of at least 4 cases where alibis changed or shifted, and half of them involve suspects who were thought to be using drugs or alcohol excessively. Casey Anthony, Amanda Knox, the John Benet Ramsey case, the Madeleine McCann case. Seen separately, Murdaugh's alibi seemed fairly solid, that his mother could vouch for him, and if not her, then surely the caregiver. After all, the caregiver would confirm seeing him there that night. The problem is, when you compare the various other versions, and you look closely at the details of the alibi, it no longer comes out smelling of roses, but instead stinks to high heaven of something fishy. You open the can of worms and it turns out that that fishy smell goes back at least a decade, and playing fast and loose with stories does too. Being slippery and slimy eventually catches up when examined in the cold light of day. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.